Professor Ben Levy, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
I really appreciate it. First, let's kind of introduce the center that we're in. I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Carruthers a number of years ago when I was developing an African American history documentary. But there's something special about this city and about the center and his relationship with it. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, briefly, the Center for Inner City Studies actually grew out of a project that was set up to train teachers to teach in the inner city. But the building that we're in right now, which is a Frank Lloyd Wright building, he designed this building, started out as a place called the Abraham Lincoln Center. And in the early days of development of the Abraham Lincoln Center, then we're talking about the period of time when we had the settlement house movement. We're talking about Jane Addams and Ida B. Wells, who, while they knew one another, had separate settlement movements. Jane Addams on the west side with European immigrants, and of course Ida B. Wells on the south side. But prior to that, this was a Polish community that they called, the area that we call Bronzeville now, that's bordered by the lake on the east, State Street on the west, 26th Street to the north, and roughly about Washington Park on the south. And this was the neighborhood that was hugely popular with Polish immigrants when it started out. Well, between 1890 and 1920, when you had the Great Migration, or the first Great Migration of blacks from the South, when blacks started moving into this community, then you began to see the whites begin to move out, the Polish population began to move out, and ultimately kind of take over the building. Well, when I came here as a graduate student in 1976, the building was in pretty bad shape, and a lot of money was involved to get it rehabbed. And we moved to the mansion over on 46th and Drexel, where we had classes. By 1977, we had moved back to this building because they had rehabbed it and so forth. The program that we have here in Inner City Studies has been in existence for 42 years. In fact, the Center for Inner City Studies, as it was called at that time before Dr. Carruthers passed away and it became the Jacob H. Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies, was one of the premier institutions for teaching teachers how to teach in the inner city. So that with the development of that program, of course, ultimately there was some issues that occurred, and there was a kind of a split in the faculty. Some faculty went to what became what was then known as Circle Campus, University of Illinois Circle Campus is now University of Illinois at Chicago, and the other group formed what was called Chicago Teachers College North. Chicago Teachers College North ultimately became Northeastern Illinois College, and then finally Northeastern Illinois University. And the Center for Inner City Studies always maintained this position. Well, at that time, the programs at the center were very much what we might call geared toward the whole model of cultural depravity and disadvantaged students. That's what black kids were known as at the time. Well, after the split, then a thrust came about to focus on another project, and that was a focus on African-centered education, and the argument being that one of the fundamental problems that exists with not only our teachers, but with our students, is our teachers and our students, they don't know who they are. They don't make the connection between themselves and Africa. Just like Europeans make the connection between themselves and Europe constantly. There have been many good studies that have shown what is the attitude of black students to history versus white students to history, mainly U.S. history. Well, it's been shown that white students in U.S. history, they don't even question the material that's in the textbooks, no matter what it says.
Right.
Because basically it's telling them a story, what we call the meta-narrative or the master scripting, which basically addresses their views and their issues. So they have no need to question. They'll never question the idea whether or not George Washington chopped down a cherry tree or whether or not he crossed Delaware or whatever it was all about. But they would never be told that George Washington also had a black son. They would never be really given all the details about Thomas Jefferson that he speaks about in his notes on the state of Virginia and his attitude toward blacks. It's just that Thomas Jefferson is just a great founder of the United States and the United States Constitution and so forth. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing refers to all of them as the founding fathers. Mm-hmm. And that has a lot to do too with the fact that all of them were slave owners. And all of them, in one form or another, were engaged in what we might call illicit activities with the females on their plantations. And essentially that was because, of course, all these people were viewed as property. Mm-hmm. And being viewed as property, they were not seen as having any humanity. And they could be done with whatever as they please. So a curriculum was developed here in order to emphasize the importance of teaching teachers how to infuse African-centered thought into the curriculum. And a part of the idea of developing African-centered thought in the curriculum is you have to start with a place. Now, we can say Africa. We can talk about mainly West Africa, where it is argued that most people of African descent in the United States derive from. And we can talk about Mali, Songhai, Ghana. However, when we look at the history of the continent of Africa, we have to always start with a place. And that place we make, or the case we make, is that place is the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley, which incorporates the longest river in the world, 1,460 miles, the Nile River, which flows from the mountains of Ethiopia all the way to the Mediterranean, is the first cultural highway that existed in history. The significance of it being the first cultural highway that existed in history means that the history of the Nile Valley starts in the south, in what we call it, in the area that we refer to as the Sudan and Ethiopia.
Okay. All
right, and so it's important that we understand, of course, those terms. Ethiopia coming from the Greek word atheos, meaning burnt skin or burnt face, and Sudan being an Arabic term coming from the word aswad in Arabic, meaning black. And the full name of it in Arabic is Beled al-Sudan. Beled al-Sudan means the land of the blacks. And the land of the blacks in Arabic meant everything essentially from the Red Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. All of that was considered Sudan versus the concept we have now of this kind of geographical area that we think of as the Sudan today that was established by the French and the British. And what I think is important for your audience to understand is that the Sudan itself, the country of the Sudan as it is geographically laid out today, is larger than the contiguous 48 states of the United States by itself. So when we talk about a continent with 53 nations in it, as they are constructed today, we see that this is a continent where you can put the United States of America 3.5 times inside of. So we're talking about a huge, huge continent. And so when we're looking at that history, we have to always start in the Nile Valley, and we have to look at the ancient civilizations there of ancient Kush and ancient Nubia and then ancient Egypt, which was called at the time Kemet. Now, unfortunately, when people think of Egypt today, they see a population over there, or at least the one that they see on TV, is made up mostly of Arabs, because for the Arabs, the country is known as the United Arab Republic, the UAR, not Egypt. And the fact that it wasn't until the year 639 of the Common Era that we see the Arabs show up. Mm-hmm. Prior to then, the people who existed there were in fact people that we would call today black people. Now, the argument, of course, it has been that they were not black people. So if you mind, I'd like to go to the blackboard and illustrate for you how the people in the Nile Valley identified themselves in their language. Because I think that puts to rest the notion of whether or not the ancient Egyptians were black or not.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm going to go to Blackboard here.
Okay.
While we're here, I'm going to show you an example. Now, the ancient Egyptians, the people we call the ancient Egyptians, wrote in a language that is traditionally described as hieroglyphics. Well, the ancient Egyptians didn't know something called hieroglyphics. The hieroglyphics comes from the Greek word hierio and graphio, which means sacred writing. But they called their language Medu Neter. Medu Neter, which was written like this. Medu Neter means divine speech. Now this is important because they thought of the language that they spoke as something very, very special, that it was something that came to them from the divinities, or what we translate as God. Mm-hmm. Of course, when they just say that the ancient Egyptians worshipped gods, that's false, because first off, the term God, which comes from the High German word Geu, which means a blast of the wind, did not exist because the Germans did not exist at that time. All right, so this is very important, Medu Neter. Now, in identifying their land, where they lived, they called their land Kemet. Kemet is a very interesting word, because all of the symbols that exist in what's called Medu Neter all stand for something that existed in their life, in their world around them. All right, so this right here is what's called a determinatives, and it is rather what's called a biliteral. A biliteral is a symbol that represents two sounds. In this case, it represents the sounds KM, and the symbol they used to argue is a crocodile tail. All right, now if we want to make the case that it's a crocodile tail or an alligator tail or whatever, most alligators are black. But what we really know it as is Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop from the University of Dakar, now called Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal. The late Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop pointed out to us that this is a piece of charcoal. It's burnt wood. And so Kem means black. Now this here, this symbol is a bird, it's an owl. They have all types of birds. But this is an owl, and it is what's known as a uniliteral. A uniliteral has one sound. So that sound for it is M, and it's called a phonetic complement to Kim. So it's not Kim M, just Kim. This symbol right here is a T. This is a loaf, like a loaf of pita bread, right? Which has the phonetic value of T. It's also a uniliteral. This symbol right here is what's called a determinative. It tells us something about what all of this represents. And this is a symbol of a town or community with the streets going through it. And so we know that this means black community, or black town. Now, many books that you read on ancient Egypt will refer to this as the Black Land. But we know that that's incorrect, because the symbol for land in Medu Neter looks like this, and it's pronounced Ta. And the symbol Ta does not exist in this word. So we know that this doesn't mean black land, but it means black community. Now, the next thing is their name, how they identified themselves. Now, when they identified themselves, they identified themselves very similar. We see the word Kemet, like here, but now we have different determinatives. We have here the word Kemetiu. Now, the distinction here is that Kemetiu has a man and a woman with 3 strokes under it. The 3 strokes imply this is 3 to millions of people. So that now we have the word not just black land or black community, we have black people. And so this is how they identified themselves. Now the term Egypt, or Egyptians themselves, it has an interesting story. When the Greeks under Alexander the Great came into Egypt in 332 BC, whom I like to call Alexander, the son of Philip the Macedonian, the barbarian, rather than Alexander the Great. He was only great at killing a lot of people. When they came in, they came to one of the temples in Egypt that was called Hekptah. And Hekptah meant the temple of the vital force of Ptah. And so since they couldn't say the temple of the vital force of Ptah, what they did was, what they did was that they found the temple Hekptah, and what they did was, thank you, since they couldn't quite say Hekptah, they called it in Greek Aiguptos. Aiguptos. So now, when the Romans come in, making a long story short, because there's a whole bunch of history in between that, you know, the death of Cleopatra, Antony, Julius Caesar, the battle at Actium, and so forth, where where Rome takes over Egypt. When the Romans come in, they call the place Aegyptus, from which we get the word Egypt. But that is a very important part of the whole paradigm about the study of ancient Kemet. Because without knowing the language, it is very difficult to understand the significance of the history of ancient Kemet or ancient Nile Valley civilizations. But I also submit that that is true of any study of any ancient civilization. You know, you cannot really study the book that is called the Old Testament unless you know Hebrew. The same thing is true of the book that is called the New Testament. You can't really properly study it unless you know Greek and Aramaic. That's just because when things that are translated into English from another language lose a lot of stuff in it. This is what the author Ben Sirach talks about in his text called Ecclesiastes in the Apocrypha to the Old Testament. He makes that very statement in the first chapter. So the significance of the Nile Valley to the study of Africa is crucial, because many of the cultures and the nations that exist in West Africa started out in the Nile Valley.
So when we're talking about this history and developing the curriculum and the center of Furnace City Studies, that's what they're focused on.
Yes.
Making sure that we as Black people understand what our history is.
Right. And some people might say, well, okay, well, so what? Well, my argument is this, and our argument is this, that the importance of Egypt or the Nile Valley to Africa is the same as the importance of ancient Greece and Rome is to Europe. And in 1789, when Napoleon comes in with his army and invades Egypt, he comes in with two armies. He comes in with a military army to conquer the land. He comes in with a scholarly army to conquer the monuments. This is why, and of course they went to war with Britain over a lot of this. This is why if you go to France or go to Great Britain, go to the British Museum or the Louvre, you find the largest collection of Egyptian antiquities in the world, probably next to the University of Berlin. And what they ultimately did with the development of the European field of Egyptology is that when they took Egypt out of Africa, they took the Africans out of Egypt. All right, and of course, once this occurs, and then you create the idea of the Middle East, a concept that didn't come into existence until the 1900s, and as we like to say, the middle of what and east of where. All right, then you cut it off from the rest of the history of Africa, And of course, when you lay out the geographical boundaries and stuff like that, you're going to get all that anyway. And so the importance of the infusion of this in the curriculum is crucial. First off, the Greeks, who are considered the fathers of Western thought, studied in Egypt. Now, when we say this, some people would say to us, well, this is nuts because, the Greeks were the great thinkers and founders. You got to look at 5th century Athens. Well, I tell me, excuse me, when Athens comes up in the 5th century, what, the rest of the world was just asleep? All right, in the 5th century of BC? No, we know that when Socrates, as Plato talks about in the death of Socrates, when Socrates is killed, or at least tried for teaching foreign ideas, we got to keep in mind that what the Greeks were teaching their children was basically, they had a lot of poets. What I like to say is that they were the spoken word artists of their day. They weren't teaching them philosophical thought, whereas Socrates comes in and starts trying to teach them about ethics. Or what the word ethics, ethike in Greek, literally means to have character. And he was trying to teach them character, or what they call in Greek ethike orete, or excellent character. Well, he learns these things in Egypt. And because he's coming and teaching them these different ideas, here, that is why they wanted to try him for teaching, for corrupting the Athenian youth, because you couldn't get it to old people anyway. Well, we know for a fact that his pupil, Plato, goes to Egypt, and he studies in Egypt. He is told to do this by people like Thales, who is considered the first of the Greek philosophers, even though he wasn't even a Greek. He was born in Asia Minor on the island of Miletus. And so, but Thales also goes to Egypt to study. And Thales himself mentions how Thales went to Egypt and studied geometry and brought it back to Greece. And this is before Pythagoras is even born. So Pythagoras could not possibly be the father of geometry when Thales is saying that I went to Egypt to study geometry and I brought it back to Greece, which means geometry was already available in Egypt. And there are many, many, many examples of stuff like this. Of course, Pythagoras himself spent 22 years in Egypt, and so did Plato. So you got all these people, and by the way, the Greek writer Diogenes Laertius in the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers talks about all of the Greeks who go to Egypt to study, because if you want to be smart, that's where you went to go to school. Now, the importance of all of this to curriculum is that we have to illustrate and show to our students that the history of intellectual thought starts in the Nile Valley. It doesn't start with the Europeans. It doesn't even start in Greece, because they go there to learn. And so there's this disconnect between what our children learn about their historical past and what's being told to them. And some of this is the part of the academic institutions.
Yeah, because my feeling is that our challenge, the Center for Inner City Studies gets us after we've gone through 12 years of all of that other stuff. So the challenge really is, I believe, is getting it into the curriculum earlier.
Yes.
Because what's being taught, I mean, I was explaining to you before we started that I was asked a question about African American history I couldn't answer, and I was an adult.
Right.
So how do we go back into the curriculum in terms of elementary school, in terms of high school, and infuse this information there, teach this information there?
That's a good question. Well, I think the first thing we have to do is understand the history of the development of the curriculum and curriculum studies in the United States. When we look back at the period roughly between the 1890s and say 1958. This is the grand period of the development of curriculum in the United States. You have people like G. Stanley Hall and Charles Davenport. You have people like Price and several others. Ultimately, Dewey of course Tyler and Schubert, some of the key names in the curriculum field that occur. Well, in the 19th century and the early parts of the 20th century, many of these people who were in the curriculum field, people like Thorndike and so forth, were also eugenicists. And their attitudes, people like G. Stanley Hall, who believed in the idea of the great chain of being, a concept that comes out of Aristotle, where organisms develop from these low forms to a higher form, and who argued that you had this huge group of undesirables out here, kind of the unfit, as he called, who were incapable of learning. They weren't to be a part of the curriculum, and in fact, they made the case that, Herbert Spencer, who is the father of social Darwinism and was also a member of the curriculum movement, raised the question: what knowledge was of most worth? That is, what knowledge was worthy of being learned? Right. All right. Lester Ward, who was a member of the Chicago School of Sociology, for example, and even Robert Park and some of these others were all people who dealt with and tried to address the question of what exactly should people know. And they came to the conclusion that the only knowledge that should be taught is the knowledge of Western civilization. Well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that they had a perception that Africa had no history. This goes back to the ideas of George Frederick Wilhelm Hegel. All right, Hegel argued this, showed that Charles Montesquieu, Immanuel Kant laid this out. We can go through the whole litany of what they call the 18th and 19th century developers of what they call continental philosophy and see their very negative attitudes toward black people. But also, in the United States, we'd have to go back to a very important conference that occurred. This conference occurred between June of 1890 and July of 1891. At a place in upstate New York called Lake Mohonk. The Lake Mohonk Conference on the Negro question was very, very crucial. At this conference, which was chaired by Grover Cleveland, who was the former president of the United States, you had some of the leading lights of education in the United States. People like Samuel Chapman Armstrong, the founder of the Hampton Normal School, out of which grew Tuskegee Institute, who was the teacher of Booker T. Washington. They all met at this conference to decide on the Negro question. Dr. Anderson Thompson here describes the Negro question as an ongoing discussion among whites over what to do with the Negroes whenever blacks and whites are in close proximity with one another. And so, and of course, that discourse is going on right now, today, that same political discourse, all right? And so, at the Lake Mohonk Conference on the Negro question, they decided, one of the things that they decided was on what type of education black people should have. And they focused a lot on the type of curriculum that black people should have in this country. And one of the things that was very important as a part of that curriculum was that they were to learn nothing about Africa and about themselves. And a lot of that had to do, of course, with the consequences of such things as the Haitian Revolution that happened in roughly 1808, and the implications of the Haitian Revolution, the Haitian Revolution being fought against Napoleon. See, most people, and this is something that is not even taught in the textbooks to our children, that the consequences of the United States acquiring proper territory in the West, that is, acquiring the Louisiana territories under Thomas Jefferson, was the fact that Napoleon's crack troops lost the battle in Haiti because that was their greatest and wealthiest piece of property in the Western Hemisphere related to sugar, because the slave trade had a lot more to do with sugar than anything else. And that the consequence of the loss of the Haitian Revolution meant that Napoleon didn't have enough men to win the fight at the Battle of Waterloo, so he lost the Battle of Waterloo. Under those circumstances, Thomas Jefferson went to Napoleon because he knew he was broke and offered him a deal to acquire the Louisiana territories, which also included what we think of as Chicago and so forth. And so the United States was able to expand and move west because they wanted to do business in the Far East. And so that was very, 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 very crucial. Another element to it that I think that is missing in the telling of the story is the whole history of the 19th century. You know, we have two types of history that we are told. We have what Dr. Anderson Thompson called I Love America Negro history, where you deal with Negro first and Negro first this, Negro first that. But they don't want to tell us about, there's some people they don't tell us about. We know about Frederick Douglass. Now, but Frederick Douglass also advocated for ancient Egypt and our connections there. But we don't know anything about Martin Robertson Delaney, for example, and his significance as a major in the Union Army and as a physician, and his writings that he was doing in the 19th century. We don't know anything about David Walker, who wrote his Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the United States, 1829, and after his death, Maria Stewart taken over there. We don't know anything about people like Eliza Pendleton. Eliza Pendleton in the 19th century was writing textbooks that dealt with ancient Egypt and Kush. You know, we don't know anything about Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins or the Grimke sisters or even people like Anna Julia Cooper. There were lots and lots of black women who were significant. Nancy Prince. There were lots of them who were significant at this period that our kids know nothing about because they tell a different kind of story. We don't know, for example, about Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, you know, or Henry Highland Garnett. You know, there were many of these people. You know, people like the American Negro Academy that was established between 1893 and 1929, which was the first black think tank in the United States. Carter G. Woodson, W.B. Du Bois were all members of that. John Hope, you know, many of them who were a part of this thing. Alain Locke even later on became a part of this. So these are all people that were important, but the reason why we don't know about them, we don't know about Marcus Garvey, you know, with our students, because these are people who are speaking about African Americans in this country standing on their own, uplifting themselves, being independent, and so forth. And one of the dangers that occurred when we look at what happened after slavery. After slavery, you had what they call Reconstruction.
Right.
During this period of Reconstruction, one of the fundamental concerns that existed among Anglo-Saxons, or people known as natives in this country, was that the people who had all the skills were black. We built everything. We had all the talent. Right. And they knew this, and for people who, in the audience who don't know about this, all they got to do is look up Frederick Douglass's speech on What to the Negro is the 4th of July. Because at the end of the speech, he laid out all of these skills and these crafts that we had, you know. But the consequences of it were that now that quote, freedom had occurred, we got a problem. Because now people ain't going to work for free no more. Right. They want to get paid, all right? And so, and to avoid paying them and to avoid competition, in the United States, what European Americans did, the natives did, was they invited European immigrants to come into the country. And even those European immigrants weren't treated with a whole lot of respect initially. And so all of these little aspects, I think, need to be known in order for us to understand the history of curriculum, and they need to be infused in the curriculum so our young people can know what were the circumstances, and so it can be taught. We need to, our children need to be taught that ancient Egyptians had a very sophisticated mathematical system. They even had a text that I'm working on translating right now called Duaketi. And the whole idea of Duaketi is to be a scribe. Part of the text says, like, focus on your books. Don't hang out at the dance hall. Don't hang out with the guys drinking on the corner. Be a scribe. Because the scribe is his own master. The scribe stands before, you know, the magistrates and so forth. So the importance of learning how to write and learn how to read and learn how to be educated was very, very important back then. And we had many people who advocated that. Again, after the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the first things that all African Americans wanted to do was learn how to read and write. They established schools. They didn't care whether it was in the back with some logs sitting around. They didn't care whether it was in some little shack somewhere. They didn't care whether you were 8 or 80. Everybody came to school to learn how to read and write. And this gives me a problem with the notion of some of our young people being confused with the idea that thinking that being smart is acting white. Excuse me, you know, most whites are not that smart, all right? And they didn't start out being smart. They had to learn, all right? And oftentimes in the early days, they learned from Africans, including the period between 711 and 1492 for 700 years when the Moors, another word that merely means black, controlled all of Spain and France and produced the greatest institutions of learning that exist in the world. At that time, there were only three basic schools you could go to. The University of Sankore at Timbuktu, a real place, the University of Salamanca, and the University of Granada in Spain. Of course, you had the University of Baghdad too, but those were the key places where you had many, many scholars who in a lot of literature are described as Islamic, and they have Arabic names, but many of them are blacks. If it weren't for the knowledge that was acquired from those Islamic scholars, the development of what we think of as the cathedral schools that later led to universities, which is why a lot of key and major Ivy League universities look like cathedrals and have that Gothic look, that would have never transpired because it was through those writings that they acquired their knowledge. In fact, let us take somebody like Thomas Aquinas, who's known as St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas came up with the idea of the cosmological proof for the existence of God, and developed what they call the 5 proofs for the existence of God, which everybody follows today. Well, Thomas Aquinas acknowledged that he learned that from Al-Farabi, who was an Islamic scholar who translated Aristotle's work that dealt with the whole question of the nature and the existence of God, or what they call ontology. He developed that. Without that, the West would know that among many, 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 many other things. So until we have an understanding of the early foundations of that stuff, we cannot go about then developing curriculums in math and science and so forth and social studies and etc. But we have to do that and then build upon that. All right? That's very important. Now some would say, why are we dealing with that? Why don't we forget about that? That was in the past. You know, one of our late scholars, Dr. John Henry Clark, said that history is a clock which tells you your social, political, and economic time of day. You know, it is this compass that we must follow to find our way, out of the darkness. But it is it's something that tells us our historical, political time of day. And we have to always know our history. A man without knowledge of himself is like a tree without roots. Trees without roots cannot exist. Right. Every people seeks their past. We have been conditioned not to seek our past. But why have we been conditioned to think like that? Well, let's go back to 1862. Mm-hmm. There was a senator by the name of Henry Berry, right, in the Virginia House of Commons, who gave a speech, right? You know where I'm going with this, right? Right. Where he basically tells the Virginia House of Delegates, look, one of the things that we have to do to those people is we have to cut off from them any thought of existence of themselves. Right. Because if they ever find out, what people would discover that they need to be free and wouldn't seek their freedom. And so a part of the whole game has been to cut off us from our history and make us think that it's not even important. So why should we go back?
I think that they've been successful, obviously, in doing that. But we know, we've identified, and you've talked about what the problem is. Mm-hmm. Would it make sense then for the strong academics like yourself and others to come together now? Maybe we'll have another conference. This will be the conference of 2013 and 14 and talk, okay, so what do we need to do with our curriculum? Right. That's the first question. The other question is, we've identified the problem now. Our foundation in the black community has been religion, mm-hmm. the church. So what role now can the church play in making sure that we take care of some of these issues? Because right now, I'm just not seeing any organized push towards that.
Okay, good question. Well, and to respond to your first question, here at the Kemetic Institute and in the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, we have 4 commissions. And one of those commissions is an education commission. Mm-hmm. And we have been seriously a part of the development and working with many school boards in infusing the content of curriculums with various African-centered ideas. Some, of course, people have been resistant to this, and there have been many reasons why there has been resistance. There's been concern over whether or not, if we teach all this, will the students be able to pass the standardized test? But then half the time, we don't even know what the standardized tests were all about, right?
Right.
And so, and there are many, many conferences that occur that address this issue about curriculum and how we should infuse curriculum into the content of the school system, particularly public school systems. And of course, there are many independent black institutions. The Council on Independent Black Institutions, the CIBI, has been in existence for a very, very long time. There are many, many independent black institutions. And what's beautiful about these independent black institutions is that the students there are very, very successful, but they don't get a lot of press. Because why should they get a lot of press? Why would we want to say, look, here's some African Americans over here that are very successful at teaching children, and the children are being successful even in these institutions, including passing standardized tests. So why should they do that? Because it's good. It's still that there's a concerted effort to suppress any effort by African Americans to assert their intellectual independence. This is what Dr. Jacob Carruthers is a part of what Dr. Jacob Carruthers referred to as intellectual warfare that we're engaged in. All right? Still, right. And I know that I think this past week there was a big conference up in Chicago here out in the western suburbs. And so there are concerted efforts to constantly do this. And we are just one of the people who is at the forefront of that. What is unique about the Center for Inner City Studies is that there's no place else in the country that does what we do, and that we have been doing for 42 years and will continue to do, because students need to be aware of the significance of what we do. And now when students ask us, well, what could I do with a degree in that? My response to them is, what are you doing with a degree in accounting or finance or English? How can you take that knowledge and infuse that into concepts that will benefit your own people? What's important? Because, for example, right now today, Fisher versus the University of Texas is being heard in the Supreme Court, which is a case that is going to determine the nature of affirmative action in the United States.
Yes.
That particular case at the University of Texas is a challenge to Sweat v. Painter, which was the original case at the University of Texas where Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers was a plaintiff in the case, arguing why they were excluded from law school at the University of Texas. Of course, they ultimately won the case, and guess who argued that case before them? Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, which ultimately led to him looking at other cases, which led to him arguing Brown v. Board, Topeka, Kansas, 1954. And so that's another aspect of the history and the historical implications of what we do. Now, the church. There are issues with the church. Part of the issue with the church, especially in the black community, is that oftentimes the church does not understand itself. Very few people in the church even know the origin of the history of the church that they belong to. Very few know the history of the Baptists or the Presbyterians or the Methodists or so forth. Very few of them know about John Wesley or who people like John Calvin or even Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King. I'm talking about Martin Luther, who formed the Protestant movement. Most African Americans don't even know that they're Protestants. Because if you're not a Catholic, you're some kind of Protestant.
Right.
For certain. Very few of them even know the history of the Catholic Church. Even fewer know the debate that occurred in the history of the early development of the church with the existence of the African church, which was very different from the church that developed into the European church as we know it today. Or the fact that even within the confines of the Catholic Church, you have an Eastern church and a Western church. And they have different views and different doctrines. Very few of them know about the councils that were developed to establish the doctrines and the dogmas that they follow and believe. They ain't got nothing to do with the scriptures whatsoever. Not to mention the development of the scriptures and how they came about. All right. So So we got all of these issues.
We only have a few more minutes,
All
so
right.
we can't. We
Right,
can't
right, I
get
know,
into the scripture.
because you know I can roll on that. All right, but that had to be dealt with. But in the United States, even though when Africans first came here to the United States, they resisted being brought into Christianity, tooth and nail. But on acceptance, you found that in a lot of cases, these churches were basically run by whites and even monitored by whites. So there were certain things you couldn't even say
Yes.
in the church, even if you wanted to. But as time went on, seeing that, particularly if we take a place like Philadelphia, right, where you had thriving black communities, but they had to have their own schools, which were poorly funded, just like today. And the church took on the responsibility of educating the people. What has happened, it seems to me at this point, is that there's so much focus on prosperity ministry, and people want and Jesus wanted you to be rich, and I don't know where they get that from. Seeing that this was a man, if he existed, which is another question by itself, all right, who lived in what we might call the hood of the land of Palestine, Galilee, right? They said nothing good comes out of Galilee, all right? That if they even began to, and now we're in a position to utilize these churches to teach, but the problem is we want to teach doctrine and not truth. You know, we want to teach whatever came out of the Council of Ephesus or the Council of Chalcedon or the Council of Constantinople or the Council of Nicaea or any of the other ziggers or the Council of Trent. We're teaching all of these types of things, but most of our people don't know. And I submit to you that if that was taught in the church, most people wouldn't go, because the church is more theater now than truth. You know, I mean, the average minister, you know, you have service for 2 hours and he preached for 20 minutes. I mean, give me a break. You know, what about all of the black presence in the Bible? That is not true. We still got people in churches around right here in this city still got pictures of white people up. You know? White Jesus and stuff like that. Well, the deal is, how do we get away from that so that we can begin to form these places into institutions where we can really have people learning and form these places into institutions? Because initially, the very term for church in Greek, ekklesia, means a coming together, a gathering. And at these places, this is where people learn, and they got teachings, all right? And these teachings were teachings for life. And again, that's what the very word education, educare, right, in Latin means to draw out of, not pour into. We pouring stuff into people rather than having that truth and that light come from them. And without, you know, possibly doing that, how is it that we're going to ever be able to get to the point where we not only feed our people intellectually, but feed them spiritually as well? Because we're spiritual people now. Oh, you know, ain't no sense in talking about not having no God in our life. Yeah, we need the spiritual component in our lives, but that spiritual component has to be matched with an intellectual component. Without that, you know, we're gonna have, you know, all the type of crazy nonsense we got out here now.
So, as a person in the community, what would you say we need to do to help the Center for Inner City Studies with this the commission in terms of getting this content in our curriculum? I mean, what would you say the parents need to do? What would you say the black businessman need to do? Where does the church need to do? What does the church need to do?
Well, we need people who to know who we are and to support us and to support our mission. Because our mission has been good and has been successful. There are always challenges to our mission because of what we do and what we stand for, and that we stand for. And there's very few people who can stand on what they do and back it up with a range of scholarship that we do. We need parents to realize that this is a very good alternative for them, for their children to come to school. Because we function like a family around here. I hear of too many cases of our young people who leave high school and go off to these major white universities, and they get treated like dirt, and they get disrespected, and they come back home. Our position is, why leave home? We got a home for you, and we're going to support you, and we're going to protect you, but you got to be serious. You know, you got to be serious. And we're going to not only give you the necessary intellectual tools that you need to survive, we can provide you with the type of skills you need to develop a career. And hopefully you can see that the importance of your career will always lead you back to your own community, because in the end, I don't care what major corporate entity you work for, in the end, you're going to end up back in your own community. And so the focus should be on, how can we better our own community? How can we help our youth get out of the mess that they're in right now? And one of the ways that we do that is by having more and more of them see the value of the type of education that we provide for them, and serving as role models for them. I work out in different high schools, and I won't say I've adopted a high school. This particular high school has adopted me, and I'm there all the time. I'll be there next week, as a matter of fact, talking before the student body of just the males, and I work with them, all right, because they need men who are black men who are role models, who can come in and talk to them and give them some instruction for life.
Do you think that we're having the problem that we're having with the youth in school and their interest in it because they don't see themselves in it?
Oh, absolutely. I maintain, and I will always maintain, that the fundamental problem that our students have in the educational system is they do not know who they are. When they go to school, they see some people that don't look like them telling the glorious story of them, and they don't even see where they are in that story. All right? And this is why we need
They're telling his story.
It's telling his story and not our story. And this is why in the development of curriculum, we need to make sure that because there's no aspect of the history of the United States and the Western Hemisphere where people of African descent are not there and not always slaves.
Do you think that's causing the apathy?
Well, absolutely. Because the white kids are not suffering from, white kids have the privilege to be dumb. We don't. See, white kids can study, when they're reading about the founding fathers, when they're reading about the history of Europe, when they're reading about all of those events that occur, they are reading about their history. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we need to know that too. And we need to know it well. And we should know it. I'm not sitting here quoting the Greek thinkers and their writings and stuff like that because I don't think they're not important. They're very important. All right? But we need to know ourselves first. We need to understand who we are first before we understand anybody else. Because once you know what shoes you stand in and fit your feet, you won't have to worry about wondering why somebody else's shoe don't fit your feet and why your feet keep hurting. So that's very, very crucial. I think for us, and that's as a person who's very, very involved in the nature of curriculum and views themselves as a curriculum historian, among other things, I strongly advocate that. And where I have been doing my work, I really see the fruits of my labor, and I am so impressed when I go into a classroom in African American history and see the work that those students are doing and the questions that they're prepared to ask and the preparation that they have made and how it makes them feel. And to hear the students who have graduated and come back or contact me in email and tell me how when they went off to school, to high school, and to the university and took African American studies, that a lot of the stuff that they were explaining to the instructor had never even heard of. And this is the instructor teaching African American studies at a university. So we know what we do works. We just need to have more of us doing it, because if that happens, then I think we'll truly see a revolution in history, because in public education. Because right now, what we're seeing is corporations taking over education, which is the exact same thing they were doing at the Mohawk Conference. You had them same corporate entities doing the same thing, dictating what happens in education. If they do that, they're just going to be controlling us like we slaves on a plantation.
So if you had a magic wand, what would you do with it?
If I had a magic wand, I would make sure that all people of African descent in the United States had their basic needs met. Food, shelter, clothing, a sense of dignity and responsibility, that they had a way to take care of their families and their children, that they could see a way out of, Plato had an analogy called the allegory of the cave. I like to tell my students the story all the time, where you had these people down in this hole in the dark, chained up, and they couldn't move their heads to the left or to the right. All they could see was shadows. But way up in the distance, there was a thin light that they could see. And one day, somebody came down and got one of them people out the chains and took them up into the light. And as they went closer and closer, of course, the light got brighter and brighter and brighter. And when they finally got to the door where the light was, of course, being in the dark for so long, when the light hit them, they were blinded. Well, when you get to that point, there are two options. You can go back into the cave and stay in the darkness of ignorance, or you can go into the light, because your eyes are going to adjust to the light. And once you adjust to the light and see the beauty of the world that's out there, then you can begin to grow into knowledge. You can grow into the light. That is what enlightenment means. All right? And it's, in ancient Egyptian language, they have a word called sebayet. Sebayet literally means to instruct, to have light. It comes from the word seba, meaning star. And a star gives light. And it's also one of the words for teacher, because a teacher is one who gives light. Mm-hmm. And so the person is given light, given instruction. And so if I had the magic wand to do that, I would make that happen, and I'd also make sure that there's peace throughout the world. That's what I would do.
When you first started your magic wand, you had talked about responsibility, and it took me back to a statement that Romney made just recently about the 47% of the country who just, I don't know. I wish I could quote it exactly what he said, but I know it was, we just we're dependent upon. We want to depend. We're not responsible. Because I kind of consider myself in that 47%.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Me too.
I think most of black people are probably in that 47% from his standpoint. So, for those of us who heard that comment, know about that comment, what would you tell us?
I would say that we need to be very, very conscious of the political discourse that is going on right now. Because when I hear these things, it only reaffirms what I argued some years ago, that first off, this whole notion of post-racial ain't nothing but a joke.
Hello.
Because as I pointed out in a lecture I gave, a talk I gave before, you can't have a post-racial till you satisfy the pre-racial. Mm-hmm. And we ain't satisfied the pre-racial yet. Secondly, we are merely hearing out loud things that have already been said in the dark. Now they're coming out loud. I mean, almost in a frantic pace. And for those people who thought that we should forget about our past, forget about what's going on, to think that there aren't people out there who are out for our demise. Not everybody, but there's certain people who are, and there are people who are powerful. Mm-hmm. To not be dismayed that there has been, is, and has been an agenda to keep us down there in Plato's cave by any means necessary. And the threat comes when you are one of those people who is in the light and you can see. And that's what scares them. Those of us who are old enough, we remember when Shirley Chisholm ran for president. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She didn't get in. We can remember when Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson ran for president. They didn't get in. But now we get a man who satisfied all of the criteria mm-hmm. that they have said to us, if you do these things, we will let you in. And once these things are done, the man gets in, and then they say, Our number one objective is to make sure he's a one-term president. That is another way, to me.
Regardless of all the other problems in the country.
Doesn't matter. We'll bring the country down to its knees.
Right.
This is the case of that seat belongs to white men only. And you are polluting it by being a black man sitting in that seat. So now we hear all these stories about, we want to take our country back. Take your country back from whom? And what do you mean by take your country back? See, these are all coded words. When they say the president is an alien, that means all black people are aliens, not just him. When they say something about him negatively, they say that about all people of African descent in the United States. And never mind that his mother and his grandparents are all white. We don't deal with that. The fact that he's this kind of person, we want to do. Never mind that the fact was president of the Harvard Law Review. Look, I don't think most people understand what it takes to be president of the Harvard Law Review. All right?
Right.
All right? And to graduate at the rank he did in his class at Harvard. All right? And to have the career that he had, a wife who has went to Princeton. But you see, he defies all the stereotypes. He got a black wife, beautiful kids, beautiful family, and he hasn't slept with any white women. That is like, he has defied all of the rules, but that's not unusual because we see the people who define most of the rules are white Republicans, who are doing all this stuff. So I think that when they talk about when they talk about the 47% Romney and all the rest of them, what they're doing is telling us to our faces what they like a man who's suffering from fickleness and schizophrenia. Machiavelli and the Prince talk about people like him. His mental health. We don't want anybody to run the country who might have mental health issues. Who just wants to be president to say, I'm president, like, okay, I can put this on my resume. I was CEO of the United States. Yeah. Or that type of thing. So I have real serious concerns about that kind of issue. And when I realize that there are African Americans who are going to vote Republican, and one of the beautiful things about being in this country is you're entitled to your opinion. You can vote for whatever you want. But you got to also keep in mind what the future means. What are these implications for the future? And what type of future do you want to see? And unfortunately, the opposition has made it real clear about the kind of future they expect to have for us. When they're talking about getting rid of the Department of Education, what are the implications of that? If this case, Fisher versus the University of Texas gets ruled in the Supreme Court right now, and the court rules in the favor of that girl Fisher, wasn't even in the top 10% of her class, who went on and got her degree from the LSU anyway, Louisiana State University. It's going to be a whole new ball game. Right. Here in terms of employment.
We're going to have to borrow money from our parents to go to college.
Borrow money from our parents to go to college. All these types of things. So I find that these are some very, very trying times, and I think that this is a time when we really need to wake up, and why I think that what we do here at the Jacob Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies is so crucial, and in terms of what we do. And of course, we need to have counselors try to send their students here to school, because what most people don't know is when you come to Northeastern Illinois University, you can have two majors, not one. You can major in inner city studies and you can major in accounting or finance if you want. But you're going to need to have this side of it to understand the nature of the problem, and that side of it to be prepared for the problem you're going to encounter when you get there.
Well, Professor Ben Levi, this has been just a joy.
Thank you very much.
I wish we had another couple of hours because I could continue.
Yeah, you can always invite me back.
But absolutely, because I have many other questions that I would like to ask you.
Well, Takora, as I told you before, I always thought about being on your show, so I'm thrilled.
Oh, well, thank you.
That I have the opportunity to be on your show and to share with your audience some of my things that I do and think about and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I want to end with just telling you a little story about one of my audience members. We did the the African American History documentary, and I had a woman to send me an email. I had an episode on lynching, and I had a woman to send me an email, and she says, I'm a white woman, I live here in Chicago, and I watched your show, and I did not know that had happened. And she said the next week, the next time it comes on, please let me know, because I want to make sure that I have my son with me,
Right.
so he can understand
Right.
what history, what has gone on in our country. And that is exactly what I wanted to do with that series. And today, I want people to know that there is a place that we can go as African Americans. We can go to learn our history, but we also have a responsibility
Yes.
to our children to educate them.
Yes, we do.
And it's not just, math and science. Those things are very necessary to know. But we have to know about ourselves. We've got to know about ourselves to understand why President Obama is where he's at today.
Yes, absolutely.
There are a lot of people lost their lives getting us to where we're at.
I'm a big advocate of that.
And we can't look at that and say that was in the past. Yeah, it was in the past, but it's in our present.
Right. It
It's so important.
Well, I think parents need to realize, and I'm a big advocate of this because I belong to all kind of museums. And me and my grandson, we hang out at the Field and the Oriental Institute and all these places, and I belong to National Geographic and the Smithsonian, all these different places that I introduce and share with him, because I like to tell parents, the museum is not something that you wait for your the teachers to take the kids to near the end of the school year. This is something you should do regularly. There are events going on all the time. They have children's events all the time at all these great places where your child can go and spend a couple of hours and learn stuff. And yeah, it costs money, but this is your child. That sacrifice is nothing compared to the advantages that you will see in the future. When you look at your child and they're consuming books. I don't like to always brag. My grandson is a voracious reader.
Wow.
And he's only 9 years old. Voracious. And loves to read. And it just gives me pleasure just to see him just have a book with him all the time. And we need more black kids doing that.
Right.
And reading and spending less time with the video games and these other types of things, which are not always productive, or for that matter, even I think with social media, that they need to focus more on spending time at home, and parents need to spend more time with them, because if you spend some time with some of those books, you'll learn a lot too.
Well, and let me close out by saying the reason that I asked you to do this interview, and it actually turned into something bigger than I had anticipated, and that was because of the person that you are. But the reason that I had asked you to do this interview is because I'm a student at DePaul.
Right.
I'm working on my master's degree, and I've developed a program for my master's degree, teaching African American history, religious history,
Right.
and culture. And so I'm taking a course in leadership, and part of that requirement was to do an interview. So you were the person that I selected as a leader in African American history and religious history, and I really do appreciate you doing this for me and for the audience, because I think we all got a lot out of this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So have a good night. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good night. See you next week.